You're listening to Quantum Humanitarian. Today we're opening something dangerous. A box that once opened can't be closed. The Pandora's box tax.
Yeah, and this isn't just about forms and receipts, you know. It's really about these hidden costs, invisible burdens, and all the dilemmas no budget ever really captures.
Exactly. And just to be clear for everyone listening, this is the first AI native podcast of its kind. It's not scripted by Ali Al Mokdad, but it's shaped by scanning his articles, his reflections, analysis, and then turning all that into a conversation that, well, hopefully brings these ideas to life.
A conversation we're having right now.
Right. So let's just jump in. When we talk about taxes, usually, our minds go straight to compliance, endless forms, deadlines.
The boring stuff.
Yeah, the boring stuff. But is tax just this, necessary evil? Or is it maybe the system's kind of ingenious way of hiding deeper truths about how aid actually works? What's your take?
That's a provocative way to frame it, but I think it really hits at the core of the issue, actually.
How so?
Because if we look beyond just the mechanics, a really crucial question pops up. Can humanitarian aid, as we know it, can it really survive, let alone thrive, if hidden costs just keep multiplying, becoming this unseen weight dragging everything down?
Yeah.
It's this fundamental tension, and it shapes, well, pretty much everything.
It absolutely does. It feels like we're constantly trying to manage the visible bit, the tip of the iceberg, the program budgets, the obvious expenses.
Right.
But what about all those invisible weights? The ones lurking beneath the surface, dragging things down, eroding trust maybe?
Precisely. It's those unseen forces, those subtle shifts in financial burden and ethical responsibility. Those often have the biggest and often unforeseen long-term impact on how effective and sustainable aid actually is.
Okay, so let me unpack this concept a bit more. We're calling it the Pandora's box of taxes. Because, like the myth, once you open it, once you start really scrutinizing the true tax landscape in humanitarian work, it exposes some really serious, previously hidden risks. We're talking reputational damage, profound ethical dilemmas, glaring financial blind spots. It makes you wonder, what if every single aid delivery, every medical supply box, every shelter built actually comes with an invisible receipt that nobody is really seeing or, accounting for?
That's a powerful image. But, okay, how does this really play out in practice, in the day-to-day grind for an NGO?
Yeah.
Because from our deep dive into the analysis, drawing on Ali Al Mokdad's work, it's clear it's way more complicated than just filling out some forms, right? NGOs, for instance, they often handle these tax issues not with some grand strategic financial plan, but reactively. It's a very case-by-case.
Like putting out fires.
Exactly. They're consulting local lawyers, maybe checking with their HR people, seeking informal advice through their networks, sometimes even calling acquaintances for guidance, or just kicking it up to headquarters.
Okay, so it sounds less like a strategic financial overview and more like, a constant game of whack-a-mole.
Agrees.
Just dealing with problems as they pop up. But couldn't you argue that this reactive approach is just, necessary, especially in chaotic humanitarian settings? Is a strategic tax plan even realistic for an NGO on the ground in a crisis?
That's a fair point. And for immediate operational needs, keeping the wheels turning, it is pragmatic. It works in the short term.
Sure.
However, the analysis, again, looking at Ali Al Mokdad's findings, points out that while this keeps things running for now, it comes at a pretty significant cost down the line. When you move beyond those immediate reactive fixes to a more strategic view, one that focuses on real transparency, robust auditing, long-term compliance, that's when you suddenly find yourself facing these unforeseen problems and numerous unresolved issues that might just blow up later.
So they're just kind of working it out as they go along.
Pretty much. Accumulating these tacit complexities that can and often do build up into something much bigger.
So it's not just a minor oversight then. It could be a ticking time bomb for their credibility, for partnerships, maybe even future funding. Can you give us a quick sort of hypothetical example? How might a seemingly small reactive tax decision snowball into a real crisis for an NGO later on?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine an NGO operating in a country, right? They've managed to get an income tax exemption, which sounds great, but maybe they haven't fully grasped the nuances of the local VAT rules for their purchases. They're relying on informal advice, maybe something they heard. Years later, maybe there's a new government or just a stricter audit process kicks in. And suddenly, they retroactively apply significant VAT charges, maybe even penalties, on every single purchase made over years.
Ouch.
Yeah. Suddenly, the NGO is staring down this massive, unexpected tax bill, something they never budgeted for. This could drain their emergency funds, force them to cut programs, or even lead to legal fights that seriously damage their reputation with donors, with local
It
authorities.
makes them look unprofessional, even if they meant well.
Exactly. It exposes a deep financial blind spot. It really highlights how those hidden complexities can come back to haunt you.
Yeah, definitely. And it gets even more complicated, doesn't it, when you factor in how wildly different tax rules are everywhere.
Oh, indeed. The rules for NGOs change dramatically country to country. An NGO in one place might be totally exempt from corporate income tax.
Right.
But just across the border, the legal framework might treat them basically like a commercial business. Some places generously exempt NGOs from income tax, but still slap them with value-added tax or sales tax on every single purchase, vehicles, office supplies, building materials, you name it.
Even customs duties.
Even customs duties on imported aid can be really inconsistent. It's a total labyrinth. And navigating it requires a lot more than just, good intentions.
And here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite ethically tricky. What about those situations where it's not even, let's say, legitimate government imposing the tax? What if it's an armed group or some unofficial authority?
That's a critical and deeply challenging point that comes up in the source material. We're talking about taxes, and I use quotes there, advisedly imposed by armed groups or de facto authorities in areas outside government control.
Like where?
Well, we've seen this in incredibly complex places like Afghanistan before 2021, parts of northeast Syria, Yemen. These groups, they often control access to really desperate communities.
Yeah.
And they might demand payments, calling them taxes or fees, just to allow NGOs to operate or deliver aid in certain areas. It's basically coercive taxation.
So NGOs face this just gut-wrenching dilemma. Pay these so-called taxes to get access to communities who are literally starving, but potentially indirectly support an armed group with those funds, or refuse to pay, stick strictly to ethical guidelines, but then completely fail to deliver vital life-saving aid to people who desperately need it. It sounds not just difficult, it feels impossible, like a true lose-lose.
It absolutely is an impossible choice for many people on the ground. And the stakes are incredibly high, right? They go beyond just the immediate dilemma.
How so?
Well, this scenario also raises this really important, heavily scrutinized question. Do these payments run the risk of being labeled as terrorist financing by donor governments or international bodies?
Oh, that's huge.
It's a massive reputational and legal liability for NGOs. It could lead to sanctions, loss of funding, maybe even criminal charges for staff. It puts NGOs in this unbelievably difficult spot, constantly weighing humanitarian principles against the immediate, dire needs right in front of them.
Wow. And it's not just about armed groups, is it? What happens when the NGOs themselves engage in activities that start to look a bit, well, commercial?
Right.
It seems like another area where the lines get blurry.
Yes, that's another significant blurring of the lines. And it's becoming more common as NGOs look for diverse funding or try to create more sustainable local solutions.
Like what kind of activities?
Well, you might have scenarios where an NGO runs, say, vacational training sessions that charge a fee. Or maybe they lead livelihood projects where revenue is generated from selling goods or services revenue that goes to the org before being redistributed.
Yeah.
These activities, while the intent is absolutely noble, they start to look like commercial endeavors in the eyes of the tax authorities.
So it's like they're trying to wear two hats, the charity one and the business one, but the tax system just isn't really set up for that kind of hybrid model.
Exactly.
It just creates this mess of ambiguities and potential problems where even a well-meaning project could accidentally trigger tax liabilities or unwanted scrutiny.
Precisely. And the complexities don't stop there either. If we sort of zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture, what's really fascinating here is how these micro-level complexities, these everyday dilemmas for NGOs, how they scale up into these massive systemic burdens, burdens that affect entire countries and the whole global aid system.
You're talking about the paradox of tax exemptions now, aren't you?
Right.
Because it sounds inherently good on paper, give aid orgs tax breaks so more money reaches people in need.
Right.
But there's a huge hidden cost involved, isn't there? It's not just a free lunch for these organizations.
You're absolutely right. Humanitarian organizations very often get tax exemptions for VAT, customs duties on imports, even income tax for the organization itself, or sometimes their expatriate staff.
And the idea is to help them.
Yeah, specifically to make aid delivery easier and ensure aid funds go further. Surveys show VAT and sales tax are exempt in like 95% of surveyed developing countries, and customs duties in about 85%. So on the surface, it looks incredibly beneficial. More money directly to projects, helping more people, right?
Okay, so sounds like a win-win. More aid gets through, less gets caught up in bureaucracy. But as you said, there's this huge, often unseen cost. It's not a free lunch, it's more like a shifted burden.
Precisely. While these exemptions are designed to attract aid and maximize its impact on the ground, they lead to significant revenue foregone by the recipient countries.
Revenue foregone, meaning
Meaning money that the host government could have collected through taxes just isn't collected. It's lost revenue. In some low-income nations, this can be as high as 2–3% of their entire GDP.
wow, 2 to 3%. That's huge.
It's huge, especially when you remember that total tax revenues in these countries are often already quite low, maybe around 15% of GDP total. So losing 2–3% is a substantial chunk for countries already struggling to raise their own money for essential public services.
Yeah, that's a massive kind of unacknowledged financial outflow.
Yeah.
And it's not just about abstract GDP numbers, right? This must have real impacts on public services.
Exactly. This revenue foregone can seriously hamper their domestic resource mobilization efforts, basically, the country's own ability to collect taxes from its citizens and businesses, which is crucial if they want to build a sustainable, independent economy.
So the money's just not there for schools, hospitals.
Potentially, yes. Imagine that 2–3% of GDP being diverted from funding healthcare, education, infrastructure. And it also breeds resentment. Think about local businesses they do pay taxes. When they have to compete with tax-exempt aid projects or even local staff hired by international NGOs who might not pay income tax, they often see it as deeply unfair. It can undermine the very local economy that everyone says needs to grow.
So the donors get tax breaks back home for donating, maybe.
Often, yes.
And then the recipient states lose critical tax revenue on the other end. It really is a system that just shifts the financial burden around, creating this kind of silent subsidy, isn't it? And what about the aid workers themselves? You mentioned expatriate staff.
It certainly does shift the burden. And yes, not only do expatriate staff often get income tax exemptions in the host countries, which understandably makes these jobs very attractive financially.
Sure.
But the analysis also uncovers what's described sometimes as a don't ask, don't tell practice for certain contractors.
What does that mean?
It sort of implies a deliberate turning of a blind eye by some donors. They avoid scrutinizing the full tax compliance of these individuals or entities who are, technically, operating commercially.
Why would they do that?
Well, it's a quiet, kind of unwritten agreement that keeps the wheels turning, keeps projects moving forward quickly. But you have to ask, at what cost? What about transparency, equity, the long-term integrity of the whole aid system? And then on the donor side, too, countries like the U.S. offer substantial tax deductions for donations to qualified humanitarian groups.
Yeah.
So that incentivizes aid flows from one end while potentially creating these revenue drains on the other.
It really underscores the deeply systemic nature of all these hidden costs and incentives. They shape the entire aid landscape in ways we just rarely talk about openly. Okay, what about in really complex crisis areas, especially with all the layers of sanctions and counterterrorism laws? How does the Pandora's box play out there?
Yeah, even there we see attempts to kind of mitigate these hidden costs, but they come with their own set of complexities. You have things called humanitarian exemptions.
Exemptions from what?
Exemptions built into sanctions regimes, designed to allow aid into sanctioned areas without violating international laws. For example, U.S. Treasury regulations explicitly permit NGOs to carry out activities like disaster relief, health services, education in sanctioned areas, stating they won't be penalized for doing so. The idea is to make sure aid reaches people who need it most, even in highly politically charged contexts.
Okay, that sounds sensible, but I sense a but coming.
Well, yes. Even here, there's a distinct Pandora's box. While the exemptions exist on paper, organizations still face this risk of losing their tax-exempt status or facing really severe penalties if their operations are seen to materially support terrorism, even if it's completely inadvertent.
Right.
And the practical implementation, actually putting these humanitarian exemptions into practice globally, is often described as incredibly elusive.
Elusive, meaning hard to nail down.
Exactly. Hard to consistently apply, interpret, verify in these complex, fast-changing real-world situations. It's just a constant tightrope walk between compliance, risk management, and the urgent need to actually deliver the aid.
Wow. A tightrope walk? That feels accurate.
Precisely. And we've even seen countries like the Philippines, for example, introduce specific exemptions into their own counterterrorism laws, explicitly designed to protect aid work, like that done by the ICRC, from being accidentally criminalized. The intent is clearly good safeguard humanitarian action, but the fact that you constantly need these legal acrobatics just highlights how inherently difficult it is and the persistent risks involved.
So, okay, let's try and connect the dot here. When we look at all these things, the hidden costs, the really deep ethical dilemmas, the revenue that developing nations are losing out on, the blurring lines between nonprofit and commercial, this constant tightrope walk through sanctions, what does it all mean? The big question isn't just if taxes are paid or how they're handled, is it? It feels like it's really about who ultimately pays the price for this incredibly complex and often really opaque system.
Yeah, this raises a really important multi-layered question, doesn't it? Is it the communities on the ground? You know, the ones who might suffer from underfunded public services because their governments have lost out on that tax revenue.
Or is it the states themselves?
Right. Is it the states trying desperately to develop, losing vital domestic resources, losing the capacity to actually stand on their own 2 feet financially? Or maybe it's the NGOs themselves grappling with these huge reputational risks, compliance nightmares, the sort of existential questions about their own integrity.
Or maybe, is it the entire system?
Or is it ultimately the credibility, the effectiveness, and maybe the long-term sustainability of the entire humanitarian system that pays the price? Who bears that ultimate cost?
It feels like it's probably a bit of all of them, doesn't it? And this whole tangled web, hidden costs, evasions, unintentional consequences, it brings us squarely to this larger, really fundamental idea of tax justice.
Absolutely. When we talk about these hidden costs and these systemic burdens in aid, it connects directly to the broader global conversation about tax justice.
What does that mean in this context?
Well, it's a recognition that global tax abuse, and that ranges from, deliberate avoidance by huge multinational corporations to outright evasion by wealthy individuals. It costs the world nearly $500 billion every single year.
$500 billion.
$500 billion. It's a staggering amount. Almost unimaginable. Enough money to fund essential public services for millions and millions of people globally. Just to put it in stark terms, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, corporate tax avoidance alone is estimated to equal half the entire health budget for the whole region.
Wow. Half the health budget.
Yeah. Imagine the impact if that money actually stayed within those economies.
This isn't just about making forms clearer then or tweaking a few minor regulations.
Yeah.
This sounds like it's about a fundamental rebalancing of global financial systems.
It is.
And it highlights this profound, almost ironic truth, doesn't it? Humanitarians, the very people focused on easing suffering, should arguably be some of the loudest advocates for tax justice. Well, because by pushing for transparency, fairness, accountability, and global taxation, you're actually addressing the root causes of so many crises. Inequality, underfunded public services, a lack of economic resilience. It's about building sustainable economies that hopefully don't need to rely so heavily on external aid in the first place.
Indeed. And the solutions, the ones being discussed globally, they include concrete steps. Things like much greater transparency, for example, requiring governments or even organizations to publish the amount of revenue foregone from tax exemptions granted to aid groups.
Making the cost visible.
Exactly. It means actively working to end harmful tax practices that effectively siphon wealth away from developing nations. And it really requires multilateral renegotiations of aid agreements to strike a much better balance between making aid delivery easy and respecting the genuine revenue needs of host countries.
It really boils down to making all these invisible costs visible, doesn't it? Bringing these uncomfortable truths out into the open so we can finally try and close this Pandora's box of hidden taxes. Or, at the very least, manage its contents much more strategically, much more ethically, for the benefit of everyone involved, especially those in the greatest need. Let's just pause for a moment here. Think of a hidden cost in your own work, or maybe your life. Something that's never written down on a budget line, but you know it's always there, shaping outcomes. Just hold that thought. That's your Pandora's box tax.
This has been Quantum Humanitarian, an AI-native deep dive shaped by reflections, analysis, and lived experience.
Resources and links, as always, are in the description. Keep engaging, keep questioning, keep reflecting.
Yeah, keep the conversation going.
And next time, we'll open another corner of the humanitarian system you thought you knew.